taught me how to live. Daddy taught me how to give. Both of them had their own sins. Down to the river, every man has felt the shame. All our blood, it runs the same. Father, hear us as we pray. Down to the river, down to the river. Sing, oh, oh, bury me, carry me, oh, oh, far beneath, oh, oh, fire and water me, going down deep, singing, oh, oh, bury me, carry me, oh, oh, far beneath, oh, oh, fire and water me, washing me clean, carry
Hi, welcome to the Cryptid Wilderness Research Podcast. I am CWR Team member Daniel Becker up here in Anchorage, Alaska, staring into the Arctic abyss. And joining me, as always, my fellow host from Quincy, Washington, Matt Slater.
Hello.
How's it going, Matt?
It's going pretty good. We got nothing but blue skies, relatively warm weather, and green grass.
I wish that we could say the same here in Anchorage, but here it's ice, ice, ice. So before we get started, I want to give a shout out to our friends and partners. First, from the Alasquatch podcast, Beans Baxter. He's out of Homer, Alaska. From Chook's Outdoor Adventures, Chook Johnson. He's out of Anchorage, Alaska. Next, it's Cryptic Investigations of Appalachia with our friends Jeff and Andy down there in Virginia.
Yeah.
And also CWR team member Duke Sullivan from World Bigfoot Central, who's got the Glag Saga continuing. And we just did a recent segment with him. We encourage you to check that out, and then also check out that Glag Saga over on his channel, because it is a fascinating account. And it, as we said when we did the recording with him, it's a must hear.
Yeah.
Also, Robin Haynes from paranormal-empowerment.com. Bigfoot Michigan Rob from BMR out of the Detroit area, as well as Tex from Texas Front Porch. Also, if you're in the Anchorage, Alaska area, we encourage you to drive out to Palmer, Alaska, and give a visit to the Bigfoot Art Gallery with Rob Roy Menzies out there. He's got some great stuff out there, and he's a friend of the show's. So today, we're going to be coming from the biblical perspective. Our guest is Derek Gilbert. Derek Gilbert hosts the news analysis program 5 and 10 for Skywatch TV and co-hosts the weekly video programs The Bible's Greatest Mysteries and Unraveling Revelation with his wife, author, and analyst Sharon Gilbert. Derek is the author of groundbreaking books Bad Moon Rising, The Great Inception, and Last Clash of the Titans. He's also the co-author with Sharon Gilbert of Veneration, a study of the Mesopotamian cult of the dead and giants, gods, and dragons. A fresh take on end times prophecy that identifies the entities traditionally called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So without further ado, let's welcome Derek Gilbert.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you for taking the time to join us, Derek. And you have an impressive resume. And as I mentioned to you before the show, you're always either writing something, hosting something, or at a conference. And it's amazing to me that you and the missus have any time to do anything. So, you guys have done some fantastic work, both in books and in the shows that you do. And so thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
No, again, thank you. But we really owe a lot of this, to, our Lord and Savior, of course, but Tom Horn, who 10 years ago offered us the opportunity to move here to the Ozarks and partner in this new media ministry venture called Skywatch TV. And because of that, we have had the freedom to do this full time, this kind of researching and writing. Our daughter was out on her own. She has been since before we moved here. And so that freed up a lot of time that we would otherwise have to spend, that younger colleagues have to invest in their families and in their children, and rightly so. So We have been blessed to follow our curiosity, and we were both created, Sharon and me, with a deep desire to learn and just try to figure out why things are the way they are. And because we had started out podcasting the way you guys are doing, interviewing people like L.A. Marzulli, like the late Dr. Michael Heiser, like the late Dr. Tom Horn, picking their brains and learning from them, we got a foundation on which we can build. So we're standing on the shoulders of giants, to borrow a phrase. And we're just, I can't imagine doing anything else. Somebody asked me last year once, if you could design your perfect job, what would it be? It's like, I'm doing it, man.
Right. And Tom Horn was such a great resource, and took on the challenges that, like you and your wife and Marzulli, Mondo Gonzalez, Gary Stearman,
Yeah.
that took on the challenges head on that the church doesn't want to talk about, but needs to talk about.
And that's the thing that's so remarkable about people like Tom Horn and Gary Stearman and the late J.R. Church, the late Chuck Missler. They're very conservative theologically, and yet open to exploring things like the UFO, UAP phenomenon, the alien, and I'll put that word in air quotes, alien abduction, alien contactee phenomenon. Cryptids, what are they? There are a lot of Christians who don't want to deal with this, a lot of pastors who don't want to deal with it because it's strange and it can bring you to public attention and not the kind of attention you want. Sharon described a supernatural encounter that she had early in our marriage. It happened a few times, and she did this on the Jim Bakker show. They're located about 45 minutes from us here in the Ozarks, and we've actually become friends with the Bakker family. And I know that's another thing that some people look at as like, okay, look, I was a top 40 radio disc jockey back in the 80s and early 90s. I don't want my mom knowing what I was doing back then. So, Jim Bakker has apologized publicly for what he did back then, wrote a 500-page book titled I Was Wrong. I don't know what more people want from him, but I digress. Anyway, there are people who watch his program just to look for video clips that can be taken out of context to embarrass people. And so Sharon went viral for reasons that a lot of people would find absolutely life-destroying. And Sharon, God bless her, she's got a thick skin. She's like, eh. And there were a lot of people who actually reached out to her and said, thank you for having the courage to describe this event because similar things have happened to me and my pastor won't listen to it. My family thinks I'm crazy and so on. And so as Christians, where part of Christianity 101 means believing that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, as Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus. In other words, we're not wrestling against human opponents, but against principalities and powers and cosmic rulers over this present darkness, evil intelligences in the unseen realm who want to destroy us. Stories like hers and many others who deal with these sort of supernatural encounters with these evil intelligences should not throw us for a loop. We should not look at people claiming it requires discernment because, yeah, a mental illness is a thing. Not everybody who claims that they're being tormented by demons is really, experiencing that. But there are some who are. And sadly, because we in the West have so desupernaturalized the Bible, we assume that every encounter like this that somebody describes is the result of someone being off their meds. So anyway, the fact that people like Gary Stearman, Tom Horn, Mondo Gonzalez, L.A. Marzulli, Chuck Missler, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, who is a very careful scholar, are willing to say, yeah, there are these evil intelligences in the unseen realm. And we as Christians need to know how to discern their activities. And, spiritual warfare is probably something that should be taught in our churches. From a biblical perspective, God bless them for trying to re-supernaturalize the Bible, to recover the worldview of the apostles and the prophets who knew that the gods, small g gods of their pagan neighbors were real.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned Jim Bakker. I've actually read that book, his book, I Was Wrong. I've read it. And as a believer, I wanted to know what his side of this was. And so I found that very enlightening, and I do catch his show every now and then. So, but yeah, I agree with you completely. So let's start at Mount Hermon. Let's start at Mount Hermon and the Watchers. For those of our viewers who are not familiar with this account, give us a brief introduction to the Watchers and Mount Hermon.
Mount Hermon is a 9,200-foot mountain that sits on the border between the modern nations of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The Israelis captured the south slope after the 1967 Six-Day War. And it's kind of amusing, given the supernatural history of that mountain, that there's actually a ski resort on that southern slope of the mountain these days. After the recent fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the Israeli military has moved around and occupied the summit of Mount Hermon, where the United Nations had an observation post called Camp Hermon. This is also the site of the highest man-made place of worship in the ancient world. It is Mount Hermon is 3 times higher than the next highest mountain anywhere around Israel. And this was known to be a place that was supernaturally supercharged a couple thousand years before the birth of Jesus. The old Babylonian copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Old Babylonian period runs from about 1800 BC down to about 1550 BC, roughly the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, down to the sojourn into Egypt by the Israelites. The Babylonians, who lived about a 4 months walk away, okay, this was not in their backyard. 4-month walk from Babylon across the desert. You really had to want to go there to get there. That copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the quest by Gilgamesh to destroy a monster called Humbaba. Gilgamesh wanted to be famous. He wanted to be, immortal, his reputation to last for all eternity. So Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu go to the cedar forest, and they kill this monster. And afterwards, according to this copy dated to 18th century BC, they penetrated the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. 2,000 years, roughly, give or take a couple centuries, before the birth of Jesus, people living 4 months away, a 4-month walk away, understood that Mount Hermon was the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. Now, by the time of Abraham, the Anunnaki had been demoted. They were no longer the great gods of Sumer. They'd been demoted to the judges in the netherworld. But still, there was something supernatural about that region. And in fact, that reference to the netherworld, that connection to the netherworld, is significant because the region just to the south, which today is called the Golan Heights, was in the ancient world called Bashan, Og of Bashan, who was the king of that region in the 15th century BC when the Israelites came out of Egypt, and Moses made Og his first military target. He, instead of crossing the Jordan River at Jericho, and I checked this, how far could the Israelites march per day, according to scholars? It was about a 2-month side trip to walk up to the Golan Heights, do battle with Og of Bashan, also defeating Sihon, the Amorite king of Heshbon, on the way, and then returning back to the site across the river from Jericho before they entered into the land of Canaan. So why did they go there? Well, when you read the texts of the pagan neighbors of the ancient Israelites, the Amorites who lived in Canaan, we call them Canaanites, but they were Amorites like the Babylonians, they believed that region was somehow connected to the netherworld. It was essentially the entrance to the Canaanite hell. In fact, the cave at the base of Mount Hermon, called the Grotto of Pan, known in the classical period, the time of the Jesus and the apostles, was called Paneas. Today it's called Banyas. Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament. It's where Jesus took his disciples on a 14-hour hike from his home base at Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, marching 30 miles, 14 hours across hills and through marshland to get to this pagan location, which was a cult center for with a temple to Jupiter, temple to the Emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus, temple to the goddess Nemesis, a temple to the demigod physician called Asclepius there. So Jesus walks his people specifically to this mountain, the base of the mountain, with this cave that was at the time the source of the River Jordan. The water that flowed out from underneath Mount Hermon became the Jordan River, and said, okay, who do you say that I am? And Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Ah, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, that this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, use a little word play there, you are Petros, and on this Petra, this rock, this 9,200-foot mountain behind me, I will build my ecclesia, my church, my congregation, and the gates of hell, which is this cave that everyone in the first century AD thought was bottomless, literally the entrance to the netherworld, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, Jesus could have gone there and said, look, this thing about this cave being a portal to the netherworld is fake news. That's not how the spirit realm works. There are no physical portals. It's all supernatural, and there are no physical portals. But no, he took his guys on a 14-hour walk to declare his divinity right there at the base of the mountain. And then according to the Gospel of Matthew, he took his disciples, James, John, and Peter, up a very high mountain, which could only have been Mount Hermon, and was transfigured into a being of light on the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, why would he do that there? In the book of First Enoch, in the book of First Enoch, which was written in the Upper Galilee, somewhere in the vicinity of Mount Hermon, the city of Dan, probably, scholars think, which is near the foothills of Mount Hermon. There's an exposition of what we read in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which is the very short section, in one that's been argued about by scholars for the last 2,000 years, where the sons of God, which is a Hebrew phrase, B'nai Ha-Elohim, that means supernatural entities, angels, for lack of a better term, who came down to earth, saw that women were pretty, and took wives of any they chose. And from these illicit unions, crossing the species barrier, if you will, there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, giants on the earth in those days, and also after that, whenever, our English translation says when, but scholars like the late Dr. Michael Heiser said the Hebrew word can mean whenever the sons of God went into the daughters of man. That's a euphemism, meaning physical intimacy. Okay, there were giants produced by these unions. Now, again, this is controversial. A lot of scholars to this day don't accept that interpretation of Genesis 6. It's not possible for angels to have relations with humans and for that to produce. Well, yeah, except Genesis 6, that's what the Hebrew actually says. And that was the understanding. And here's the thing. That was the understanding universally amongst Jewish religious scholars until the 2nd century AD, and among Christian theologians until the 5th century AD. The early church and Jews until the 2nd century. That was Theology 101. Yes, back in the day, Genesis 6, these supernatural entities came to earth, violated what they had been, their instructions from God. The early church believed that they had been instructed to shepherd humanity in the years following the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve had disobeyed, kicked out of the garden. Okay, they're there with these animals out there and they don't know anything. So here, you go down there, watch over them, take care of them. And instead, these sons of God apparently tried to corrupt the human bloodline and create a hybrid army to take away dominion of the earth. And the place where these angels came down to earth and made their mutual pact to corrupt humanity, not only by corrupting the human genome, but by teaching us things we weren't supposed to know, like sorcery and how to make weapons out of metal and things like this, was on the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, again, Jesus could have said, all of this is fake news. I know you've read the book of First Enoch. At the time, it would have been the book of Enoch, because 2nd and 3rd weren't written until centuries later. But he didn't say that. And in fact, recent scholarship within just the last 20 years shows that there's a section just following the Book of Watchers, which is the first 36 chapters of the book of 1st Enoch, chapters 37 to 71, called the Book of Parables. Jesus actually takes some information from that section of 1st Enoch that had not been found in any prior Jewish writing and applies it to himself. The title, specifically the title, The Son of Man. That's not in the Old Testament. There's a reference in Daniel 7 to one like a son of man, but that's a Hebrew phrase that you see a lot in the book of Ezekiel that basically means one who looks like a human. But in the book of 1st Enoch, this one called the chosen one, the anointed one, the Son of Man, he's going to come back. God is going to send this chosen one, this anointed one, this Son of Man, to bring and execute his judgment on these sinful angels who've messed up the world, evil kings, and so on. And 30-some years after that book was completed, according to recent scholarship, Jesus was applying it to himself. So, yeah, 1st Enoch explains in the first 36 chapters why the world's in such a mess. These sons of God, these watchers descended to Mount Hermon. And then the second section, chapters 37 to 71, here's how God's going to fix it through one called the Son of Man. And it all centers around Mount Hermon. Jesus, I think, validates it by taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and declaring his divinity there and on the summit of Mount Hermon.
So were these angels that descended, the watcher angels, were they part of Satan's initial rebellion? Did this happen afterwards? Where is their relationship into Satan's original rebellion, do you think?
That's a really good question. Satan, I identify, and I think most people, most Bible teachers, Bible scholars do, with the serpent, or the Nakash, that's the Hebrew word, in Genesis chapter 3, the one who tempts Adam and Eve into rebelling against God's authority. You know, did God really say? And so they ate the fruit and got kicked out of the garden for that. Genesis 6 was led by a different rebel, and that was the point of my previous solo book, The Second Coming of Saturn, because the leader of this rebellion is named in the book of 1st Enoch as Shemiyaza, which is a Hebrew phrase that roughly translates as the name has seen. The name Hashem is what Jews today is how they refer to God, Yahweh. So, and the irony there is that Hashem, the name, did see what Shemiyaza did, and for doing what he did, Shemiyaza in 1st Enoch is sent to the netherworld and punished by being, chained up in darkness. And this is confirmed in the New Testament, actually, 2 Peter 2, verse 4, where he writes that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but thrust them down to hell, is the English word, but the Greek word is Tartarosis, not Hades. Tartarus is a separate place in the netherworld reserved for supernatural rebels. So we also see this in Jude verses 6 and 7, where Jude confirms that, yes, the sinful angels are being held in chains in gloomy darkness until the final judgment. So the question then is, what's the relationship between the sons of God in Genesis 6 and Satan? Because Satan, we see in the Old Testament, he still got access to the throne room of God in both Job chapters 1 and 2 and Zechariah chapter 3, where he's accusing the high priest in the time of Zechariah. And in the New Testament, he's described as a ravenous lion seeking whom he may devour. But Jude and Peter place those sons of God from Genesis 6 in chains in the netherworld. So, okay. So Shemiyaza can't be Satan because Satan's still roaming around free. Shemiyaza's in chains in the netherworld. So as I wrote the book, Second Coming of Saturn, trying to figure out, why did this guy disappear from history? Why is he not in the Bible anywhere? Well, he kind of is, but you have to dig a little bit into the Hebrew. The reason the book is titled The Second Coming of Saturn is that I believe this entity, Shemiyaza, is the one who's been known by a variety of names throughout history. The Babylonians and Akkadians called him Enlil. He was called El by the Canaanites, Milcom by the Ammonites, which means he was Molech. And God had some very specific things to say about Molech in the Old Testament. Also, Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans, and a few other names in there as well. So that's where that came about. So the question then is, why did he choose to rebel after Satan had already rebelled and got humans kicked out of the garden? I talked with L.A. Marzulli about this. In fact, this is on one of our early programs for the Bible's Greatest Mysteries, where he speculates that Satan may have talked Shemiyaza into doing this, knowing that Shemiyaza and these other colleagues of Shemiyaza's would be thrust down to Tartarus, as Peter wrote, leaving Satan as the dominant entity among the fallen realm. In other words, Satan very cleverly used God to get rid of his rivals in this rebellion. We see in Revelation chapter 12 that Satan is a seven-headed dragon who's thrown out of heaven by Michael and his angels, and there's war in heaven. So there is still a battle to be fought. Satan is clearly the leader of this end times rebellion, but it's possible, and this is one of the arguments I make in the second coming of Saturn, that Isaiah chapter 14, which is the famous "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer" chapter, that Lucifer is not Satan. Lucifer is Shemiyaza. Because again, in the Old Testament, Satan is never connected to the netherworld. He's never connected to the Rephaim or the mighty men who were of old. But we see in Isaiah 14, this rebel, Lucifer, which is just a Latin translation of the Hebrew name Halel ben Shakar, is greeted by the Rephaim in Sheol when he hits the netherworld. Hey, look, you're as weak as we are. Scholars agree that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are parallel chapters, and in Ezekiel 28, this entity, Lucifer or Halel, is described as, you were the signet of perfection till iniquity was found in you. Every precious stone was your covering. Our English Bibles have 9 precious stones described in this covering that he wore. But when you read the Septuagint translation, which was translated from older Hebrew texts, the Hebrew Old Testament, into Greek in the 3rd century BC, and this is about 1,200 years before the Masoretic text, the Masoretic Hebrew text on which our Old Testaments are based. So the Jewish scholars in Alexandria translating this into Greek for the Greek king of Egypt, Ptolemy, were working with manuscripts that presumably no longer exist. And they translate that section of Ezekiel 28 as including 12 precious stones in this covering that this rebel wore when he was in Eden. And interestingly, those 12 stones are exactly the same 12 that were in the ephod worn by the high priest. The ephod that was the garment that God gave Moses the instructions to create for the high priest to wear in the tabernacle. So
And that was the chest plate, correct?
That's correct. So I suggest in the second coming of Saturn that this entity who led the rebellion in Genesis 6 on the summit of Mount Hermon might have been the high priest for the angels in Eden before he rebelled.
So when the Nephilim, let's go over to Genesis 6. So the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after that. The angels cohabited with human women, creating a hybrid offspring that became the giants. So was there people say, oh, well, there couldn't have been any Nephilim, after the flood. But it says, and also after that, did the Nephilim survive the flood, or was there a second incursion?
Well, I don't think the Nephilim survived the flood. I don't think God would be incapable of doing what he set out to do. And so when the Bible tells us only 8 survived the flood, I believe it. 8 survived the flood, Noah and his family. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Again, remember, Dr. Michael Heiser, other Hebrew scholars who can read Hebrew, point out that word when can also mean whenever. So that opens the door to the possibility of a second incursion. The explanation that Sharon and I put forward in our book Veneration, which deals with this cult of the dead, and we know that the Canaanite Amorite neighbors of the ancient Israelites venerated the Rephaim, the demigod heroes of long ago. And by the way, we also showed from secular peer-reviewed research that the demigods of Greece were just the Rephaim of the Amorites. The Greeks knew who the Rephaim were. And so Heracles and Perseus and Bellerophon and Cadmus and all those guys, they're just the spirits of the Nephilim that were destroyed in the flood of Noah. It is possible that, and this is Sharon's bailiwick because she's got a degree in molecular biology with an emphasis on genetics, that epigenetically, people like Nimrod, who was the first to become a mighty man, a Gibor, okay? The Gibborim, sometimes a term used in the Old Testament to refer to these giants of the Old Testament or of the pre-flood world, may have accomplished some of the supernatural or superhuman, anyway, feats of strength by through rituals that switch on genes that are normally not active in humans. We pointed out in the book Veneration that in 2 Samuel, where David and his men are doing battle with the surviving Philistine giants, and I forget which chapter it is. Forgive me, I don't have it open in front of me, but they're described as descendants of the giants, including one whose name was Ishbi Benob, is how it looks to us in English. And he's described as a descendant of the giants. Except in Hebrew, it actually says descendant of the Rapha, not Rephaim, the Rapha. So the giant, perhaps, or is Rapha a proper name? We know that there was a Canaanite or Amorite deity called Rapayu, which could be Rapha, and there are Canaanite texts that say that this Rapha or Rapayu ruled at the cities of Ashtaroth and Edrei, which were the home cities of Og of Bashan. In other words, the ruling cities of this deity, who is described in the Canaanite text as the king of eternity, ruled over the entrance to the Canaanite netherworld. Now, is that what that phrase in 2 Samuel means, descendant of the Rapha? Don't know. Scholars have not figured that out. But here's the thing. That phrase translated descendant in Hebrew, Yelid, is not used of one who is a genetic descendant of someone else. It is a Hebrew word that means one who belongs to a group into which one has been consecrated or initiated. In other words, Goliath and his friends like Ishbi Ben-Ab, and I'll get to the meaning of his name in just a second, were more likely members of a warrior cult who worshipped an entity called Rapha or the giant. So, because again, that phrase, it was not B'nai Ha-Rapha, sons of Rapha, it was Yelid, which means devotee, or I think the best word, devotee of the Rapha, worshiper of the Rapha. The closest comparison I can make would be like the Viking berserkers of 1,000 years ago. Guys who would go into a battle and their opponents said that they don't feel pain, they don't feel heat, they don't feel cold, they can't be hurt. But they were so insanely violent on the battlefield that even the Viking kings came to an agreement. In less than a century, they said, let's not use these guys anymore. They're killing our own men. So let's just, no more berserkers, please. The name Ishbi Ben-Ab, actually pronounced Ishvi Ben-Ov, gives a clue as to who these Philistine giants actually were. Ishvi Ben-Ov. Ben-Ov means son of the owner of a necromantic ritual pit. And this is something I went into some deep detail in the second coming of Saturn. Ov is a term in Hebrew that derives from an older word from the Hurrian language. The Hurrians are an ancient people who originate on the Ararat Plain, below, the mountains of Ararat, in like the 5th millennium BC. And they apparently had a practice of digging a ritual pit into the earth, sacrificing small animals, and then summoning entities, spirits, gods from the netherworld. The woman in 2 Samuel, who's described as 1 Samuel, when Saul goes to visit a medium the night before he's killed by the Philistines, the medium of Endor, or the witch of Endor. She's actually the Ov of Endor. And you remember in that story, the spirit of the prophet Samuel comes up from the earth. And it's because that's what she was doing. She was a ritual pit. Now, our friend Brian Godawa, who wrote a series of books called The Chronicles of the Nephilim, in the book about David, included this scene in the book and made this giant who almost killed David, Ishvi ben Ov, Ishvi, son of the Ov, the son of the woman who summoned Samuel without intending to, the night before Saul died in battle. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that connects those two, but it was an interesting plot device. But I think this is what we're looking at with those spirits. And again, this was Theology 101 in the ancient world. Jewish religious scholars until the 2nd century AD and the early church until the time of Augustine in the early 5th century believed that demons were the spirits of those giants destroyed in the flood of Noah. And those demons are condemned to wander the earth, tormenting humanity until the final judgment. So this is what we are trying to reintroduce to the church today. We're not trying to look at the Bible and try to come up with sensational new ways to read the Bible because it sells lots of books. No, we're just trying to reintroduce to people the supernatural worldview of the Hebrew prophets in the early Christian church, because this is how they saw and understood the Bible.
Let's talk about, since it's so hot on the stove as of late, let's talk about aliens and the link that aliens have to all of this in Genesis 6. Everything on Mount Hermon, it all kind of links together. And over the last several years, we've seen the United States government come out with congressional hearings, and it's just starting to, we've been desensitized to the point where now it's just like when they start talking about UAPs, we're like, yeah, okay, whatever. Where if you would have mentioned this back in the 80s, for example, people would have been probably glued to their televisions. It's just the whole, you can see the desensitizing occurring. Talk about the alien phenomenon and how it links into Genesis 6 and Mount Hermon.
Well, again, the key there is understanding that most of the contact by abductees and contactees is telepathic, or at least that's how they describe it. It is supernatural. It is not physical. Although I know that there are those who have encounters that feel very much like physical encounters. Again, my wife had one, actually several, going back to the early years of our marriage. Haven't had anything like that in 20 years, praise God. The weirdest thing we've had since then is something that we call the roof walker, which again has not happened in some years, but we've never figured out what it was that was literally walking on our roof at night, heard by Sharon, me, and a guest in our home. So multiple witnesses to that.
Wow.
If this is the weirdest thing that the enemy can throw at us, well, okay, I guess we're being protected pretty well. But if we understand that these entities that we call aliens or extraterrestrials, seemingly since the 1940s, when the modern UFO phenomenon began, consistently appear or contact people who say that they're receiving messages from, the Ashtar Command or whatever, is coming telepathically. Well, okay, from a Christian perspective, we say, yeah, we understand that. There are people who are dealing with this sort of thing, except instead of calling it contact or abduction, we call it night terrors and sleep paralysis. In other words, demonic oppression and that demonic contact. The physical aspect of it, in other words, the craft that are seen at night, the majority of those craft are misidentified passenger planes, military craft, astronomical bodies like the planet Venus or Jupiter, something bright in the night sky. But there's a small percentage that cannot be explained away by natural phenomena. And I'm okay with the idea that there may be entities that are trying to deceive us by showing us things that we feel, since we can't explain it with our understanding of science, must be coming from off planet. But I think a lot of that is the result of us not understanding exactly how much energy it takes to cross the distances between the Earth and even the nearest stars, which is almost impossible to comprehend. Gary Bates did a documentary several years ago called Alien Intrusion. John Schneider was the host for the documentary, and they went into some of the scientific obstacles that would have to be overcome in order to cross, say, even just 4 light years between here and Alpha Centauri. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling. Not to mention the fact that in order to get to the speeds you'd need to make it in a reasonable lifespan for a biological entity, if you even hit something like a grain of sand at that kind of speed, it would be like detonating a nuclear bomb on the outside of the craft. Now, I'm probably butchering the science because that's not my area of expertise, but the point is the obstacles for traveling between the stars is minimized by science fiction. So when we see Star Trek going to warp factor 9, okay, there's a reason it's called science fiction, because it is a plot device used by writers to get around the fact that going from here to the nearest star would literally take hundreds of years with current technology. And again, no guarantee that somewhere between here and there you wouldn't run into something in the middle of what appears to be clear space that would destroy your craft. So I am of the belief that there is no firm evidence, recent congressional hearings notwithstanding, that we have been visited by legitimate extraterrestrial entities. Now, has the Earth been visited by extra-dimensional entities, non-human entities? Yes, since the very beginning. I mean, in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve saw the Nakash, which is translated into English as serpent, but it's also used interchangeably in a couple places in the Old Testament, like Numbers chapter 21 and a couple of chapters of Isaiah, with the word seraph, which is the singular form of seraphim, the entities that Isaiah saw in the throne room of God in Isaiah chapter 6. Nakashim, seraphim, you've got these fiery serpents with 6 wings, according to Isaiah. Okay, flying fiery serpents. That sounds like a dragon to me, but it may explain the reptilians that some people have reported seeing. I think biblically we can say, yeah, there are reptilians in the Bible, and the Hebrews encountered them in the desert, and it was not a pleasant experience. So I think bottom line is researchers like Jacques Vallée have come very close to hitting the truth when he said that the apparent ability of craft to violate the laws of physics is not because they've got technology that we don't understand, but it's because they're moving in and out of our dimensions. And again, this may be the work of fallen entities that are trying to convince us that we're being visited by extraterrestrials. When I started looking into the research here of what people believe, and Donna Howell and Allie Anderson did a really good job in the section of the book, Destination Earth, exploring how this would affect the faith of Christians if entities were to land on the White House lawn, say Klaatu, Barada, Nikto. There are more people, according to surveys, who believe in extraterrestrials, believe in that we are being visited by extraterrestrial life, than who have a biblical worldview. And this is as it's defined by George Barna of Arizona Christian University. 6 points of basic Christian doctrine, like you can't earn your way into heaven, Jesus literally rose from the dead, things like that, Christianity 101. And the percentage of Americans who believe that is like 4%, but it's like 36% believe we're being visited by ET. So Yeah, I think as Christians, we need to be able to address this issue. And I think there are issues when we start looking at it this way. It's like, are you saying we've been visited by inhuman entities? Well, yes, I agree with you. Now, like Paul on Mars Hill, let me explain who these entities are, these mysterious entities are, or at least offer a biblical explanation. Then we can get into the nuts and bolts of why it's so hard to build a spaceship that'll cross from Earth to Alpha Centauri.
One of the things that alleged abductees claim is that they're having sperm taken, they're having human reproductive organs taken, etc. What is the goal of these entities with the reproductive stuff and the alleged breeding programs?
Yeah. If it's true, I would suggest that it is simply a modern take on what we saw in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. And these entities wanting to hybridize humanity, to breed humanity out of the equation, or to create a hybrid army, to, I don't know, do they think they can wage war against Jesus when he returns in Revelation chapter 19? I don't know. Would people who have been hybridized still be able to be saved? Or is that just a psyop to convince people that they can no longer be redeemed if they've somehow been hybridized? Because we've heard this question too. I think my child is one of the Nephilim because I've been assaulted. Well, if they can ask the question, what must I do to be saved? Then they can be. That's my view. We're also seeing, though, this sort of hybrid program taking place in labs all over the world where you're seeing human DNA being commingled with that of animals. And again, this gets back to what happened in the pre-flood world. In fact, in First Enoch, this is one of the sins that's laid at the feet of Shemiyaza and his colleagues. They began to sin against the birds and beasts and creeping things and the fish. Is that why we had these monstrous reptiles in the ancient world? The sauropods and the theropods that were just immense? I don't know. But I think that's what's implied here in the book of First Enoch. Understanding that First Enoch was probably written about the 4th century BC, at least that first section. But this was the sin of which these sons of God, the Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, were accused. And I think what we're seeing today is a means, or an effort rather, to try to do the same thing, to hybridize humanity, to make us inhuman, if you will, without having to physically without having to risk the punishment that group who descended to Mount Hermon have had to endure, chained in gloomy darkness until the judgment.
Matt, let's bring up the picture of the book, Destination Earth. Yeah, there we go. I just completed this book, and fantastic job by you and your partners. Well done. And it gives a lot of explanation to a lot of the questions that I've personally had. And I also liked it because it's a good counter to that TV show Ancient Aliens. And I'm gonna call them out for a second, because it seems like, from my perspective, just my, Daniel talking, is that show goes out of its way to do everything they can to fight the biblical narrative and to get people looking the other direction. Tell us about this book, Destination Earth.
Well, it was, I think, timely, because we're seeing the interest, especially since the release of the widespread release and publication of the Tic Tac video in December of 2017, when the New York Times article by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal was published. Again, Congress has had a number of hearings in recent months about this phenomenon. It's gone mainstream since the end of 2017. We've seen it on the corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Tucker Carlson seems to have a special interest in this. Mainstream newspapers like USA Today, Washington Post, New York Times, of course, which ran that first story that sort of broke the wall down and made it acceptable for the corporate media to talk about this issue, people are asking, is Jesus an alien? Is God an alien? And Donna and Allie really addressed that in the first section of the book. I tackled the section, where do we get these ideas that are sort of like received wisdom now amongst the UFO community, that the gods of the ancient world, the gods of Mesopotamia, Enlil, Enki, and Inanna, and Sin, and so on, are just space travelers from planet Nibiru. And you dare not even question that anymore. This was the effort that we put into the book to try to address those questions. And Donna and Allie did a really good job of showing that, look, from a theological standpoint, no, God is ontologically not an alien. I mean, he's fundamentally different from who we are. So if you want to use the term alien to mean different, then I suppose you can use that word, but it certainly doesn't mean he's an extraterrestrial. But I think the thing that really opened my eyes in digging into this phenomenon going back to 1947, and not just Roswell, but even earlier, the Maury Island incident and the Kenneth Arnold incident, the wing-shaped craft that he saw off the coast of off the Oregon coast, the intelligence community for the United States specifically, but I'm sure this is true with other nations as well. In the U.S., the intelligence community has always tried to control the narrative. And that's been true since 2017, in fact. What was really surprising when I dug into that Tic Tac video and found that UFO researchers had known about that video for quite some time. It had been available on YouTube since about 2007. But when the author of an article about that incident for a website called Fighter Sweep, which is published by and for fighter pilots, so it's a rather narrow audience there, the author of the article got in touch with the FA-18 pilot from the USS Nimitz, Lieutenant Commander David Fravor, who's been part of this story since it broke in 2017, and wanted to refresh his memory about the story before he published it on the website. And this was back in 2014. And Fravor told him, what's really weird is that a couple of years ago, that video disappeared from the web, and that everybody who was connected to it on the Nimitz, on the USS Princeton, which was the submarine that had been part of this exercise, the radar operators, the fire control operators, who all spotted this thing. They really did see something. They were all contacted by a 3-letter agency. Which one, I don't know. DIA, NSA, CIA, who knows? And told, you didn't see nothing. Shut up about it. But then suddenly in 2017, it comes out and it goes viral. And suddenly now UFOs are mainstream. Why? I don't think it's coincidental that we're seeing now at the end of 2024, the New Jersey drone story, very close to a U.S. military facility that manufactures and tests drones for the Pentagon. I think it's a leap of logic that we see often among the UFO community. If we can't explain it by something obvious, it must be aliens. We see that on the Ancient Aliens program over and over again, Giorgio Tsoukalos. We don't know how they moved such a huge stone, so was it aliens? Well, not necessarily. I mean, I don't want to rabbit trail too far, but just because Giorgio doesn't know how it happened doesn't mean you can jump right to aliens. I mean, the biggest stone ever moved in history, just to throw out one example, the Thunderstone beneath the statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg, Russia, weighed like 1,600 tons when they began moving it in 1760. So this is during, recorded history. We know how they did it. And guess what? It didn't involve aliens. It didn't even involve any steam power, not even any animals, just a bunch of Russians with ropes. So yeah, just because you don't know how they moved the stones at Baalbek doesn't mean it was aliens. It doesn't automatically follow. Just because we don't know how that Tic Tac moved faster than an SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest plane known to man, doesn't automatically follow that it came from Zeta Reticuli. But there are people out there in the intelligence community who would prefer that we think that, then we think that, hey, the Chinese have a new drone that we can't defend against, or that we have a new drone we don't want the Chinese to know about. Or perhaps entities in the fallen realm, principalities and powers, who want us thinking that our space brothers are here just waiting to make contact with us to help us ascend to our next level of evolution.
So before we get into your next book and talk about that, in your opinion, do you believe that the alien phenomenon that's taken place nowadays and has taken place since Roswell is part of the end times deception?
I think it could be. I think that the end times deception is going to be multifaceted. It's not going to be just one thing. L.A. Marzulli, I know, has been talking about this for a long time, and I certainly see how people could be drawn into it. I mean, you look at the movie Independence Day, when the alien ships hover over our major cities and the blue lights are flashing, and you get all these people standing on the tops of buildings looking up, and, oh, it's so beautiful. Well, you know, there's a segment of our population that would respond that way. They're so technically advanced, they're technologically advanced, superior to us. They must be good. Well, we've got a long history on Earth of technologically superior civilizations coming into contact with technologically less advanced civilizations, and it usually doesn't end well for the less advanced civilization. In fact, our friend Dr. Judd Burton pointed out, and this is one of the points that they make in their book, Decoding Göbekli Tepe, that the advanced technological civilization contacting the pre-flood world were those watchers who descended to Mount Hermon. So what we're seeing in the modern UFO phenomenon may be just an updated version of that. They're advanced. They must be better than us. Welcome, our space brothers. And then, you know, blammo.
Matt, go ahead and bring up that next book project, The Gates of Hell. Tell us about this one.
Well, this is one that was inspired, obviously, by the phrase Jesus used when he took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and said that, I'll build my church on this rock while standing in front of this really tall mountain that was believed to be essentially the Canaanite Mount Olympus, where the gods met. And, the gates of hell will not prevail against my congregation, my ecclesia. But we wanted to take it back further in history because there are megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, like Gilgal Rephaim on the Golan Heights, the middle of ancient Bashan, the entrance to the Canaanite netherworld. We actually had an opportunity to spend a full day at Gilgal Rephaim 2 years ago with the archaeologist who's done the most recent excavations there, and show how this cult of the dead, this cult of summoning spirits from the netherworld, but beyond that, summoning spirits from the other side of the veil, from beyond the gates of hell, is ongoing to this day. And we get into the modern UFO phenomenon for that reason, because there are those who, for example, like the group called the Nine, led by CIA contractor Andrija Puharich, dating back to like 1953, led a group in what was essentially a seance, and believed that they were hearing from a group orbiting the planet referred to itself as the Nine. There are also gates that can be opened through psychoactive drugs like ayahuasca, DMT. And so our point with this book was just showing that, yes, while Jesus did take his disciples to a specific physical location and said, yes, this cave over here, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church, our point is that those gates are wherever we are if we open ourselves up to the spirit realm.
Now, before we go into the area of cryptids, I've got to ask you about CERN.
Well, that's been one that a lot of people have been really made a lot of people nervous. They're trying to open portals into another dimension. Well, yeah, they are. But as a Christian, and looking at the opening of those portals, there is a time in the future in Revelation chapter 9 where the key to the bottomless pit is sent to earth with an angel. And that's when the bottomless pit will open up and things come out. 1946, there was a couple of guys out in the desert Southwest, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, who were devotees, acolytes of Aleister Crowley, went into the desert and performed some rituals, sex rituals, for the purpose of bringing the woman in scarlet, and again, this is a reference to the book of Revelation, the woman in red who rides the beast, to earth. She's referred to as Mystery Babylon in the book of Revelation. And there are people who've noted that it was not long after they performed this ritual that the modern UFO phenomenon kicked off. Well, our friend Dr. Michael Heiser pointed out, I think, something very astute. If these entities that we're supposed to be so afraid of require the permission of a couple of deviants performing twisted sex rites in the desert to enter our domain, then they're pretty lame, and we shouldn't be too worried about it. So when it comes to CERN and other physical portals, that's my feeling. They're not going to open anything that God does not allow them to open.
Absolutely. Excellent point. So moving into the area of cryptids, which is mine and Matt's area. So there's a lot of theories about what these cryptids are. And we'll talk mainly about Sasquatch and Dogman. Sasquatch and Dogman seem to be the two main ones in our neck of the woods that people talk about. So one of the theories is that these cryptids are, particularly Sasquatch, are watered down descendants of the Nephilim. Have you heard that theory before? And what do you think about these cryptids known as Sasquatch and what they could possibly be?
We have heard about them. It's not been a focus of our research, but I think it's possible that these are large primates that just have escaped scientific detection over the years. They don't necessarily have to be of supernatural origin, even going watered down. Again, it would require a second incursion, and while I don't dismiss it, I lean to the belief that the sons of God, those Elohim, small e Elohim, lesser Elohim. I mean, there's one capital E Elohim, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jesus as well for us Christians, and lesser Elohim, meaning a denizen of the spirit realm. They saw what happened to those 200, according to the book of 1 Enoch, who crossed the species barrier. And they're in a very unpleasant place right now. Dr. Rick Renner, as we interviewed him recently, said the word translated darkness, the Greek word in Peter and Jude, refers to a darkness that is so oppressive it can be felt. Okay, so it's not just the absence of light, it is an oppressive darkness. That's what these entities, how they've been punished over the millennia since they sinned. So I tend to believe that these other Elohim, watching what happened to them, are not inclined to cross that same line and suffer the same punishment. They're more inclined to get us to do things like rituals that may have cause epigenetic changes in us, to engage in experiments that involve crossbreeding humans in a test tube with, a pig or a monkey or what have you, and or cloning, which would mean creating a new human life without it being the typical way, with a sperm fertilizing an egg. What is that? What kind of connotation does that have spiritually? Would there be a soul or a spirit inside that entity? I don't know. Bible doesn't tell us. We can only speculate. So is it possible that these cryptids are the descendants of the Nephilim? I tend to think not. Again, Gigantopithecus maybe didn't go extinct. And that we've got some fossil remains of this giant ape that could be what Sasquatch is today. Or it is possible, perhaps, that, as I mentioned from the book of 1 Enoch, the sin against the birds and the beast and the creeping things and the fish may be where these beasts of unusual size came from. But again, I think that is limited to the pre-flood world. I think that the spirits seeing what happened to those who crossed that species barrier the first time, probably not inclined to do it again. So I tend to think that there's a naturalistic explanation for things like Sasquatch.
Now, you make reference to the species barrier, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the judgment was so severe on those angels that even some of the other angels were startled by it. Is that correct?
Well, there's nothing in the Bible that says so. And there's nothing in First Enoch that says so either. There may be some other extra biblical texts that indicate that. But yeah, again, the speculation is that it was Satan who talked Shemiyaza, Azazel, and the others into doing this thing, knowing that they would be punished this way, and that was Satan's way of clearing the field and allowing him to step up as the leader of the rebellious faction of fallen angels.
So in some of the people we've spoken to about Bigfoot, there are claims that these creatures have some supernatural abilities, including the abilities to come and go through portals, mind speak, and other abilities, while others people claim don't seem to have them. Have you heard about those characteristics of these cryptids?
I have. There was a friend of mine who's since gone home to be with the Lord, who was a researcher into the dogman phenomenon, and was of the belief that the dogmen had certainly superhuman, if not supernatural abilities. But this is not an area that I've studied. I've been focusing on Sharon and I focusing on the ancient texts to find out what the neighbors of the ancient Hebrews believed, and how that was drawing the Hebrews into worshiping these fallen angels and demons.
Well, again, hats off to you and your wife for being willing to address the issues that the church doesn't want to talk about, and take a practical as well as historical and scientific approach to these topics. It's very, very important, and it's very important that this research gets out there. So to our viewers, we highly encourage you to check out the works of Derek and Sharon Gilbert. Want to turn the ball over to my co-host Matt Slater up there in Quincy, Washington, before we close. What you got, sir?
I just wanted to say thank you for coming on the show today. It's, again, like I said before the show started, this isn't my wheelhouse. My compass is kind of spinning, but I'm learning, and it's fascinating to learn about the old texts, how things were, and how they saw things back then. To me, it's fascinating, and there's a lot more for me to learn.
Well, and likewise, you guys are doing research that we have not done. And I don't pretend to be an expert on the modern cryptid phenomenon, but I am very open to their existence. In fact, this is something that Sharon has woven into the plots of her series of supernatural thrillers called the Red Wing Saga, which starts with the Jack the Ripper murders, and speculates that perhaps the Ripper wasn't caught because he wasn't human. And it was through her research for these novels that we learned that the superintendent of Metropolitan Police in 1888, when they were trying to catch the Ripper, was Sir Charles Warren, who found the Watcher's Stone on the summit of Mount Hermon, this inscribed slab of limestone that said, "By order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here." So she was able to take that and then weave that into the story. Now, officially, that stone wasn't unboxed and translated. It's at the British Museum now, not on display, interestingly, but it was unboxed in 1903. But in her stories, the Red Wing Saga was unboxed in 1870, and something got out. So there's a literal connection between Mount Hermon and Jack the Ripper And so in her series, she goes there. She brings in vampires and werewolves and other cryptids that, a lot of Christians like, oh, no, those are just stories and just made up. So, again, not my area of expertise, but we're right there with you. And we appreciate the work of researchers like you digging into the modern evidence for their existence.
And we love having these cross-topic discussions where we can talk openly about the alien phenomena, about the cryptid phenomena, about biblical perspective and history. And you and your wife have put in so much time and so much research. It's just very impressive. So well done. Hats off to both of you. And thank you for doing what you do and giving people a different perspective to consider, and a very important one for the church to start addressing.
Well, Jesus came to save us, but what we're just trying to do is show people that he came not just to save us from ourselves, but to save us from these entities who have rebelled against God and who want to destroy what he created and called good.
Right on. Tell us what you got upcoming. What do you got on the horizon for you and Sharon, and tell us where our viewers can find you.
Well, we are going back to Israel in the fall. We'll be there between October 19th and 30th, God willing. We've had to reschedule this 3 times already now, thanks to the war over there. But we plan to go back and visit sites like Gilgal Rephaim. There is a site very similar to it that is on the bank of the Jordan River, about 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. And that's where we think Jesus was baptized. And we go into that in the book, The Gates of Hell, explain why Jesus was baptized there and not down by Jericho, as most people think, including the United Nations. If the UN says it, I guess it must be true, but we're going to politely disagree. So that is our big trip for the year. There is one more possibly, and this really depends on whether I feel I'm mobile enough to do this, because it looks like it would be a little more physically challenging. But we'll see about that. We are planning a book for later in the year called Prisoner Zero, which is a reference to a Doctor Who episode. But it's basically about chaos and how we think chaos was actually the first rebel in the Bible, not Satan in Genesis 3. We think it was Leviathan in Genesis 1. And I know there's some scholars we respect who disagree with us on that, and that's okay. But that is our next book project. We hope to have a video out before too much longer on the physical location of the Valley of the Shadow of Death. That is a literal place, we believe. And we will show in this video, which we shot when we were in Israel 2 years ago. I'm just slow when it gets to editing video. Why we think it is where it is. And again, how it relates to this whole conflict between the fallen realm, fallen angels and demons, and the loyal angels who've remained faithful to God, with humans kind of caught in the middle of this conflict. What did it mean to walk through the valley of the shadow of death? And how did Jesus signal its location through where he placed his ministry? Our website is, almost forgot that. That's the important thing. gilberthouse.org. That's where they can find, people can find whatever we do. gilberthouse.org.
And you've got a view from the bunker, which I really enjoy.
Well, thank you. Thank you. But again, all of that other stuff, I mean, I could list all of our, I think we got 7 websites or something, which is nuts. But it's all linked at gilberthouse.org.
Excellent. Great topics, great discussion. Derek Gilbert, author, researcher, filmmaker, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. So from Anchorage, Alaska, I am Daniel Becker. From Quincy, Washington, my co-host, Matt Slater. And we will see you next time.